muito bem ao longo do Fórum do Desenvolvimento.
Along the Development Forum, we have a fishbowl on regulation, innovative instruments, and also partnerships for development. Today, our guests will debate the Brazilian economy in transition. And so we would like to invite for this conversation Lavínia from BNDES, Julia Braga of the Fluminense University, Federal University, Rafael from the Minas Gerais University, José Roberto Afonso of the Brasilia Institute for Public Development, and Luiz Esteves from the Bank of Northeast, and Sávio Caçador of the Development Bank of Espírito Santo, and Luciano Schweizer of the Inter-American Bank for Development. And now I'll give the floor. I'd like to welcome you, Lavínia Castro. Good morning. Thank you, Adauto, for your introduction. Good morning. It is an honor, and I'm very pleased to be here participating in ABDE Forum. I'd like to thank Sérgio Guzmão for the invitation, and also to congratulate all of you who are working in the organization of this event. So many of you who are working in the production. Thank you for such an important seminar for the development system carried out in such a difficult moment for our country and in the middle of a pandemic. We are going to divide this panel into two blocks. The first block will address industry and employment, and the second will address infrastructure and macroeconomic. So I'd like to invite Carlos Pinkusfeld, José Roberto Afonso, and as a debater, Luciano Schweizer and Sávio Caçador. So I'd like to invite Professor Carlos Pinkusfeld to speak to us about macroeconomics outlook and the structural challenges of the Brazilian economy. Thank you. I will share a presentation. Thank you, Lavínia. Thank you, ABDE, for the invitation. So the title of my presentation is Brazil in a World in Transition, but it is certainly a world in transition. So I adjusted the title. So there is no doubt that the world is in a transition. It is multipolar, geo-economic, geopolitical, whether we want it or not. It is also going through a technological transition, quite relevant. It's an energy transition as well, the standard of energy, etc. There's a lot of dynamism in the world. The problem is that we are not very dynamic here. This is a projection I'd like to share with you. If we look at an optimistic scenario, the per capita income of Brazil was stopped or stagnated for 13 years. In my projection, I'm talking 18 years for us to go back to where we were before. So this terrible performance shows that we are not doing well. Since 2014 to 19, we was ranked 180 in 194 countries, and some of them are in war. So we are in a situation that is not positive. In a transitioning world, we are not doing well. And I said I was going to speak about industry. So our industrial production are shown here in this graph, 2014, and these are the peaks. And we also have declines. So we have capital goods, we have intermediate goods, we have durable consumption goods. So we are not well again, fifth or 10th in some sectors, behind the peak of 7 years ago. So we are worse than we were, much worse than we were 7 years ago. So in services, we're not doing that much better regarding the previous peak. But it is seasonal. December, we're 11% under the peak of December 2014. It is important to say that there is a sector that helps us, communication, especially because of the pandemics, but we're still doing badly. We had a retrocess, and in a transitioning world that requires for fast change. But we have not always been like this. This graph shows us in relation to other countries in Latin America. Until 1930, we used to be very poor, and then we can see now our performance in comparison with Argentina, Chile, Peru, Colombia, and Uruguay. So we did quite well for quite a period. And here, obviously, we're growing very little because of regrettable decisions at the domestic scenario, but we are even worse. As you can see, I don't know if you can see, there's the blue line with current transactions. This graph shows in red the GDP variation, and there's a green line that there is a breakage, a small decline there in the middle in green. So we worsened economic growth, and we also worsened in current transactions. It should be the opposite, right? So after 2009, we can see a very bad structural decline. This is a restriction to growth. If we want to grow, we cannot continue like this.
And as Lavínia mentioned, this is related to the industry, our performance here, but this, as this EED data shows, we have high technology, medium technology, low technology industry. And so in the transformation industry, there was a small surplus that dropped after 2009 and up to 2015, because I didn't want to get into the acute recession after 2015. And so this phase, with this negative transition in Brazil, there is a huge deficit of high technology industries and medium and high technology and even medium to low technology. And so a big gap, a drop in current transactions as measured by our industry at a transition moment from 2008, 2009 was a transition point with significant deterioration of industrial performance with strong impact externally and on the demand side, as well as external restrictions, which were considerably worsened. And so it's really bad in these two senses. I'm not going to be repeating this, but of course we have to resume industrial growth, because that's where you have generalized productivity gains and intra and intersectoral relationships and innovation for other sectors and production of goods with more income elasticity and, well, the deterioration of exchange. So there is an inversion here in relation to exchange, but there is here this issue of income elasticity. And these are sectors that involve energy transition, artificial intelligence, and that we should try to be on board. And So some interesting results. Any methodology, there's the discussion on deindustrialization and delays and so on, but in recent work by Modesto and Passoni, showing that when there was a growth of the economy, well, there wasn't a deindustrialization. And so what I mean to say is that it's fundamental to resume growth. There's no innovation in terms of purchasing of new machines. Well, you can give it up. There were many industrial policies, 2004, 2008, 2011, but the results were not what was expected. And so we should look at these unsuccessful or policies with less results than expected before formulating future policies. But this is a world, a completely different world. And so we are in a transition towards IoT and 4.0 industry, energy transition, artificial intelligence, etc. But this is occurring. Well, currently we're moving back. And in a world of global or regional value chains, I'm not going to get into the details of it, but this renews the problem. So if you think you're going to get into these chains from the bottom, we don't have competitiveness in Brazil for this. And if we want to get into it from the top, we are too far back in terms of development technology, etc., and several other issues that I'm going to point out now. So is the homework being done? Are we doing our homework? Scarce perspective of vigorous resumption of the economy. There's no reasonable scenario showing that we are going to return to strong economic growth. Without that, we cannot have any industrial acceleration or renovation of the industrial hub without this. And so we need to grow again. We had some experiences with industrial policies that were reasonable, but there's no clear signaling that of industrial policy. And so that's another issue that we'll have to tackle if we want to move into this modern world. It's the issue of value chains will have to be negotiated with. We have an interesting geopolitical position in a multipolar world. We are part of the BRICS. We are close to the US. Getúlio Vargas taught us how to do this, of course, in a more tense environment at the time of war. But we also have scale. We have size. We have economic interest in participating and becoming a big domestic market. And with that, we can try to expand. So, finally, in order to do this complex combination of economic growth leading to industrial modernization and bringing to Brazil a negotiated entry of value chains into sectors that might bring about some absolute advantage or perhaps geopolitical or geoeconomic leverage with China, with the United States, which in turn will have to be combined with some degree of industrial policy, some sectoral direction or targeting. But that requires infrastructure growth, because this technological change will be done with a big change, a significant change in telecommunications, in transport. We need you to conclude, please. So how to do this? With cuts in expenditures. So we're not doing 1, 2, or 3, and we're failing in 4. The last graph, with this degree of public investment and brutal drop in relation to previous years that were not that spectacular, we're not going anywhere. So we have a lot of homework to do in order to try to position ourselves more positively in this global transition. Thank you. You've shown us very interesting data. Actually, our next presenter, José Roberto, it's a pleasure to have you with us. So we've just shown the industry and its relevance for employment. Now we'll move on to the importance of the agenda of development banks in face of the worsening of employment data and conjunctural and structural issues affected by the pandemic. Thank you. I'd like to greet you and the other colleagues participating in this session. As Carlos said, we are facing a huge challenge, not only in terms of conjuncture, but also in terms of structure. And in view of the calamity that we are experiencing in all senses, especially the human tragedy, we have a unique opportunity to make changes that can lead us to a new world. Families, even companies, have already made changes. It's the government that hasn't, or some governments haven't. And public policies have not yet been adapted to the new reality. The main point here is that the pandemic, we are not going back to what we had before. It's no use targeting recovery. We need to target reconstruction. That is the inspiration for Biden's plan in the US and also the European discussion and plan. And as you said, employment and labor are no longer synonyms. In the past, Keynes, perhaps, Keynes with his theory of employment and the construction of a welfare state focusing on employment and salary. And then you have public development policies targeting employment in terms of formal employment. Before the coronavirus, we already had a dilemma, a succession of crises which were quite severe in Brazil. The virus arrived in Brazil before a full recovery from the 2014 recession. We hadn't even returned to the 2008 levels, as Carlos showed us. And so there are two structural elements that to be added there. Automation, which is irreversible, which initially destroys employment. It can generate new employment, new jobs, but this depends on public policies mostly for reskilling and in order to cater to new demands. And so, for instance, we have a shortage of data scientists in Brazil and around the world.
The other trend is of independent work, especially among youth. Most youth don't want to have a fixed job where they have to go to. And all this impacts on the public side, especially financing of public policies that are based on jobs and salaries, especially Social Security. We need to find, in this sense of challenges, generating jobs and employment, but also reconstructing public policy. And in this context, in my opinion, development banks play an essential role. Of course, they need to continue with everything they used to do before, but we will need to find jobs, but also we have 17 million companies in Brazil. I don't think we have anything like that in the world. Many entrepreneurs left registered work because they lost their jobs and they can't find any other, and now they are in entrepreneurship. So the development banks reconcile social and economic development, not just now, but before the pandemics, they already had this role. So in Brazil, we sometimes think there is a dichotomy between private markets and development banks. I mean, only in Brazil we see it like that. It's not like that anywhere else in the world. We have seen even movements of the creation of private development banks. I confess I had not had time to delve into it. So it has this broad vision of reconstruction as a development bank. But even more developed economies and the most liberal economies that didn't used to have development banks, such as the US and the UK, did create development banks. I live here in Portugal, and after some decades, in Portugal also created its development bank. In Europe, we have the Bank for Reconstruction and the Bank of Development. So these banks have been crucial to supply with liquidity the market when the central banks did not do that directly or by governments. And very often this involved the action of development banks, reconciling resilience and reconstruction. Resilience as in surviving the crisis, and reconstruction as a new type of living with new foundations. Until November last year, $480 billion were involved with development banks, and the KfW alone injected 100 billion euros. Countries that had their own used them, and those who didn't have one created one. Brazil, I believe, this is a single case of a country that had its own development bank, and it did not use it as a key player in the combat to the pandemics. I think it doesn't have a strategy. Some people even don't think there is a pandemic in Brazil. It's just a code. So reality imposes itself. It is greater than any opinion. And now we have an agenda. We are far from leaving the crisis. Actually, investment in public health are crucial for us to leave this crisis. It's obvious. But public health in Brazil is a sector that leverages a lot of work and jobs. In the health sector, we have a huge impact in the economy. There is a work published by Fiocruz, by the Celso Furtado Center, showed all the potential around that. And in my opinion, development banks should focus on that as well. Reconciling health with their mandates. In Brazil, there was a moment when there was the economy was stopped, was stagnated, and at the same time we had no We had other parts of industry that was also stopped. So we do need reconstruction that will be more digital, will be greener, and it will be more social. In particular, the Brazilian arrangement, which is the FAT, which is the Fund to Support Workers, but it is only for employed people. We need to create this fund and an insurance policy to cater for other types of workers that are not registered workers. So we can also use that fund in the generation of development by the BNDES, and at the same time, it has a cyclical kind of role, combining fiscal responsibility with economic and social responsibility. And it can be expanded to be not only a fund for PIS/PASEP, but covering the whole of social security and having greater articulation and liaison with the private sector. So both the FAT and the development banks will have to play a major role, whether we want it or not, in the inevitable reconstruction that we will have to do in our economy and in our society. I'm sorry I was late. So I'll comment later and I'll give the floor to debaters. It is a pleasure having you, the floor. Thank you, Lavínia. It is a pleasure to share this panel with you, with all of you. So I have worked with Lavínia before. Professor Carlos, I watch you on YouTube videos, Professor Carlos, and obviously Professor José Roberto also. Long worker in development. As far as I heard, we're going through a moment of transition. We are like, we have just suffered an earthquake. And the good news that we had is that the development system are still standing and showed their relevance when the country faces very difficult situations. And the challenges are only starting. Another important point, it has to do with the capital markets. And
transactions continued happening, and the bets on in this area continued. As José Roberto mentioned regarding the public development banks, it's clear that there is a group of capital holders and that things are not doing well. We need to do something to change direction. Along these same lines, the bonds and sustainable investments are not reinforced by the same logic. And of course, the single health system is an asset that proved how important it is to be strengthened at times like this. Historically, these kinds of pandemics will repeat themselves. We can expect more of them. And so, José Roberto, addressing the industry in connection with health, it's very important to continue addressing this through multiple dimensions. For instance, there's the issue of the aging of the Brazilian population. On the other hand, companies and families seem to already have adjusted, and so the situation is given. And this will probably lead Brazil to changing its development axes. So I'd like to draw attention to the work led by Lavínia and an article published in December 2015, which is about working with scenarios. And so one of the scenarios that she mentions in the article is the world as a windmill, a mill. And so if we don't want to direct this transatlantic Brazil, this huge country, towards a very complex situation as described in the scenario, we should take some measures to prevent or to avoid and to correct the course of our country. Another important point mentioned by Professor Carlos is related to the regional blocks. So this is a movement in transition. They're moving. Brazil, always dependent on agribusiness as if success were guaranteed. I don't see it that way. I see important, significant investments made in Africa and in the east of Russia, in areas that are with ice melts. And so the world is going through a transition. It's important to understand this and reinforce again that we need to look at the future, look at the scenarios, and see how we're going to position ourselves in order not to be surprised, learning lessons from the past. And so I'll conclude my comments here, and thank you very much for the invitation to participate in such a highly qualified panel. Thank you. Thank you for your contribution. I will give the floor to Sávio Caçador for his comments. Good morning, Lavínia and panel colleagues. Thank you once again to ABDE for the invitation to participate in this event since Monday. I am going to make a slightly different comment. José, Roberto, and Carlos are in a better position to talk about the current scenario in Brazil and in the world than myself. And so I am going to I'm going to take a slightly different stance. And so the discussions we've had along the week, we've been discussing these very strange times. We've been talking about development and cooperation and issues that are relevant. But perhaps today might be difficult to talk about these issues in such strange times. I'd like to reinforce the role of development banks, especially the subnational development entities. Experts claim that the main economic justification for the existence of a development institution is market deficiencies that affect the supply and demand of investments due to several issues: market power, external factors. Since development institutions are supported by the state and funded by the state, they do have a competitive advantage over private operators. And so they are better positioned to address market deficiencies. Their economic rationale is related to their capacity to facilitate financing, and where private operators don't operate for several reasons. That's why we understand that it's important for national and subnational development institutions to have regular funding in order to finance development. It might seem a bit heretic to say this nowadays, but particularly I don't see how you can develop without well-targeted resources and a clear policy and clear guidelines of where we want to arrive, what we want to achieve. Brazil might be a country with most experience, with more laboratories for industrial and regional policies. Some perhaps not as successful as other countries, but in my view, we actually haven't reviewed the results of these policies and made adjustments and corrected the course of such policies. So I'd like to present to you, to bring to you a proposal that was presented at ABDE at the end of 2017. It's a proposal that was presented by José Roberto Afonso, who on the occasion it was proposed as the development fund of the state. And so the goal of the proposal was to develop fiscal and financial modeling that would allow, in an innovative fashion, the regional development. And when we talk about regional, it's not only the classic traditional regional, we're talking about industrial policy, scientific and technological policy. All this is included with strategic repositioning of the development institutions, especially at the regional level. And so in a partnership between governments, between the federal government and the governments of each state, and exploitation of the capital market in order to resume growth and investment. So it's a proposal for the resumption of growth investment with a regional perspective. We know that in the past few years, some subnational development institutions have been addressing their funding problems, going to the market, issuing bonds, but this is a reality that unfortunately is limited to the bigger agencies. I'm not criticizing anyone here. Congratulations to them. They're doing a good job, but we know that many subnational institutions find it extremely difficult they lack the technical resources for this. And so what we propose is we want to resume this proposal so that all development institutions might have regular funding, allowing for a regional development policy at this time of crisis. We understand this is a very important instrument and alternative to this end. So I'd like to conclude and give the floor back to Lavínia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now I will speak before I give the floor back to panelists. So, yes, José Roberto is right, but as Luciano mentioned, the health sector has major interconnection with industry, in the pharma industry, in the supply of equipment. And I believe that out of the policies I mentioned in Brazil, that was one that had a good performance, even though it's not excellence. For example, in terms of pharmaceuticals. You are right. When I spoke about industry, and that was my subject, right? Industry is important, even if the final demand be generated by the service sector. So it will provide support, be it for pharmaceuticals or hospital equipment. So it is a dynamic area that should be taken into account. So I do agree totally. It is one of the development axes that we should take. And we need to use what we have in terms of advantage. We have a public sector that is right, that is large. We already have existing pharmaceutical industry that has some technological development, and we need to use these elements in order to leverage and be included in the new world in transition. There is a book with an article that I authored. It has to do with Biden, maybe the new Roosevelt, quote unquote, and the discussion of Roosevelt with Keynes. I addressed that because Keynes thought that Roosevelt was not very forward, and Roosevelt thought that Keynes was a bit, was into everything. So it was a bit like that in Bretton Woods as well. And why am I saying that? Because we have a bit of the Keynes position that people repeat, a dead economist. No, it is the opposite. Economists need to follow politicians. So in the US, we have the numbers of deaths. And if you compare the US and China, I mean, something had to be done, and it was done, and the economists follow, giving inputs and contributions. The idea is to indicate paths, but we can only change if there is a political change. We can help, but sometimes it's quite difficult. I don't know if it's good or bad. Thank you. José Roberto, you have the floor. Just to complement what Luciano mentioned, there are very strong changes of paradigm all over the world. I have seen major efforts of the IADB in terms of digitalization of the economy, which is another key factor. Once again, development banks should work on that as well, and doing the liaison and encouraging innovation, and on the other hand, coupling with the new needs and demands that emerge. And in the middle of that, training and capacity building. In particular, I believe that digitalization of public services, we spoke a bit about SUS, about the health sector. I would say that the whole of the Brazilian public administration is lagging behind. We used to be vanguard, and now we are lagging behind the rest of the world. It is good and bad. The good is that there is a lot to be done, and this can help. We could start with health, with the health sector, with our system. But public administration needs to be inside a mobile phone. And just doing that generates a lot of jobs and employment, it generates a lot of innovation, and the IADB has been doing quite a lot of that. And Sávio mentioned very well when he mentioned the importance of us tapping on to the opportunities of gathering expertise, more than the financial capacity, using the expertise of development banks of analyzing projects and making this in combination with the private sector. Some have liquidity but cannot deal with the long term, cannot analyze projects, and this pandemic brings us great opportunities. For example, the huge amount of savings. Yes, we know that crises end up leading to savings. Here in this crisis, people are precautionary, not only because they are afraid of being unemployed, but they are afraid of dying. And people cannot do things they used to do before, so they save. So savings are very high among Brazilian families. At the same time, we have the interest rates of the public debt is very low, and the result is, among other things, is that the middle class is going to the stock exchange in Brazil. So this reinforces liquidity. We have new players, fintechs, we have very large internet companies preparing to come to Brazil and in the rest of the world. What we need to do is to make good use of this funding that is allocated because of lack of options. And together with adequate public policies and using the expertise of development banks, we can use this opportunity to open financing of industry, as mentioned before. Yes, the industry in general, as well as the health sector, the car industry that could be manufacturing ambulances and etc. They are long-term projects and they need financing that is long and stable. This is very serious in Brazil. We have spoken a lot about the changes of the indexes in Brazil for more stable indexes so that we improve investments. But we need to take this advantage of the excess savings brought by the pandemics, placing public and private sectors to finance and create new opportunities for investment and development in Brazil. Thank you, Lavínia.
Thank you. Many elements, and so very quickly, before moving on to the second block, Professor Carlos gave us a very interesting overview. We are used to looking at Brazil in relation to GDP and the US, and he showed our performance compared to other Latin American countries. Also, external restriction, which is the object of his work, and also the industry, showing how technological intensity and loss of high and medium technology industries is leading to a drop in our current transactions. And so this is a very important issue. And he has addressed industry as fundamental for productivity gain, for intersectoral relations, demand, generation of innovation, production of goods with greater income elasticity, all very interesting elements for our discussion. And this is related to our role as development banks in leading this very intensive recovery, technology-intensive recovery. And so, comments, Luciano's comments, thank you for reminding us of the scenarios. And so this is what scenarios should do. It's not about predicting, it's looking at trends and taking a position and acting to avoid future problems and drive more promising futures. That's the objective of scenarios, and thank you for mentioning this. Now, some comments on Professor José Roberto's presentation. So he addressed the renewal of development banks in the world. given the challenges, the issue of employment, the future of employment. We don't want employment, we want skilled employment, decent employment, no development without employment. And he also addressed issues related to financing, the FAT and the amount of resources. Over 500 executives of the BNDES signed a letter on the importance of the FAT, and in order to also warning about a reduction in the amount of financing, and these are resources that would generate more than 7 million jobs. Of course, we need other instruments, all sorts of bonds, and well, this is one path. It's very important, and all development banks are headed towards this. And there's also the issue of the fact that at times of crisis, resources disappear, and we need institutional mechanisms to guarantee long-term financing. Sávio mentioned the subnational banks and the infrastructure and technology work. We need well-directed, well-targeted resources also. And so moving to the infrastructure block. Thank you to all the speakers, and I'd like to invite Professor Júlia Braga. Professor also Professor Rafael Ribeiro to discuss infrastructure. And the commentators are Adauto, Modesto, and Luiz Esteves. I'll give the floor first to Rafael Ribeiro, who will talk about infrastructure, and also the connection between infrastructure and poverty, and also highlighting regional aspects of the development system. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. I'd like to share my presentation introduces some thoughts about the role of infrastructure for economic development. And it's connected to a very strong research line that we have here at the Regional Development and Planning Center of the University of Minas Gerais. I'd like to start by making a link with the previous speakers, Carlos and José, how external restriction, which is a bottleneck that hinders growth in the country and is associated with a drop in the degree of productive sophistication, this is strongly connected to several other factors, one of which I'd like to draw your attention to: the low level of investments, the drop in infrastructure investments that we've observed in the past few years in Brazil. So, if there is a hindering of growth on the demand side, we export increasingly less sophisticated products with added value. This is due to strong limitations also in terms of supply of infrastructure, generating bottlenecks for the productive sector and hindering companies from advancing in the production of more sophisticated goods. So, take, for instance, the electricity sector in Brazil, which is completely deteriorated. A small growth in this sector, this puts pressure on the electricity sector, creates a bottleneck also in the infrastructure. And so this graph shows that in 2014, right after we lost the game to Germany, the championship to Germany, we've had strong fiscal restriction and adjustment. 2016, we had the expenditure ceiling, and so we see a drop of public investment, much higher drop than in private investment. So from 2014 to 2019, a drop in public investment of 52% and in private investment 17%. And so we have insufficient infrastructure to deal with productive bottlenecks in the Brazilian system. Professor Carlos has already made a long presentation a detailed presentation on the critical situation of Brazil and tragic situation of Brazil. Obviously, after the pandemic, beyond the pandemic, there are other challenges to resuming growth. It's a situation that has been worsened by the pandemic. I will quickly make a cost-benefit analysis in general, analyzing the benefits of infrastructure, both from the point of view of economic growth, the better known ones. And so we have increased productivity of companies, favoring maintenance and durability of private capital. So if you have good quality of the supply of infrastructure services, this allows companies to spend less with replacement and maintenance of all sorts of equipment, also greater durability of vehicles on roads, for instance. And so you spend less, the private sector spends less with the maintenance of capital. There's a reduction in transportation and logistics costs, positive impacts on health and education of workers, increasing productivity of labor. And there are also scale and scope economies, because investments in energy, telecommunications, and transport, they facilitate technological innovation and access of companies to new markets, driving economic growth. Now, one aspect that is less discussed is the positive impact of supply of infrastructure on reduction of poverty and income inequality. So it's a factor that needs to be added in the infrastructure investment analysis in terms of sustainable growth. When we talk about sustainable growth, we are speaking not only from an environmental sustainability point of view, but also social sustainability. And this should be a concern also when we assess infrastructure investments. Literature shows, in general, that infrastructure investments tend to generate better prospects of salary gains by increasing labor productivity, thereby reducing poverty and inequality. Also, the supply of infrastructure tends to increase the productivity of companies, thereby the goods and generating drops in the prices and favoring or benefiting workers with increased purchasing power. The infrastructure investments, they reduce the cost of energy, communications, and roads, and with the reduction of cost of living, this also increases the well-being of the population and poverty levels. Greater access to basic services such as water, sanitation, and solid waste treatment tends to reduce poverty in more multidimensional levels. It's not only about giving more income to the poor, but it's lifting the poor from a situation of little political power. And so this kind of supply is also very important in reducing poverty and inequality. Another aspect that needs to be considered,
especially when we talk about financing at the regional level, is to consider that infrastructure takes place in the space. So discussions about the geographic area and the spatial side of things is quite large. So infrastructure investment affects the decision about the localization of agents, where things are, where agents are, etc. So there is a trade-off between efficiency and equity at the space level. And literature shows that investment in roads in central areas and in poorer areas can generate greater economic growth, but it also ends up by bringing about inequality because of the search for larger markets. Obviously, the opposite as well. Sometimes infrastructure or transportation investments in poorer regions end up favoring labor to larger or to richer areas. So there may be inequality among regions, and this should be considered. Of course, sometimes a growth in richer areas can bring poorer regions together. And sometimes we have a win-win situation where both gain. Telecommunication investments, for example, can favor a lot of a spin-off and generate growth in both regions. So at the regional level, we need to look at agglomeration and dispersion. Agglomeration, because when we invest in a region, we have companies being attracted to the investment in the region and makes them gain markets and efficiency. On the other hand, it also generates dispersion, both regarding labor and rents. So this regional scope needs to be evaluated when we consider infrastructure investment. And this is a cost-benefit analysis. And in terms of cost, investments in infrastructure are not financially neutral. They can generate significant costs, both because of the increasing competition for private credit and for the increase of taxes. And the benefit is not necessarily positive, but literature shows that the return to infrastructure capital tends to be to bring significant bottlenecks in the productive sector as well. Well, there are some hindrances to infrastructure investment in Brazil. Low efficiency of the planning and execution of projects and the low level of development in the capital market because of several differences, and income inequality enters in this quite strongly. We also see the recent reduction in the participation of public financing in a moment of economic crisis, and also the low attraction of investment of a foreign development institutions. It's not active, and BNDES can help solve these bottlenecks. I believe that cost-benefit analysis is that we need to think that we want the good things but not the bad things. So we need the coordination of the state to minimize costs and to have the optimization without unsustainable discourses. Thank you. Thank you. Now, Julia, you have the floor. Thank you for the invitation, and I will share a presentation as well.
Então, como já foi falado pelos outros panelistas,
as mentioned by speakers before me, Brazil has been in an unprecedented situation in the last decades that ended up affecting the stock of liquid net physical capital. And if we look at that, we can see that as of 2015, this capital stock was stable, stopped growing, opposite to what was happening since 1996. And there is depreciation that is higher in terms of the accumulation of the new capital stock with a light decline. So I'd like to start by saying that quite a lot have mentioned in the economic debate that Brazil is not the US. Therefore, it could not have an infrastructure investment plan as mentioned by President Biden. But Brazil is not the US, in fact. But Brazil is also not South Africa. And South Africa is planning, it has a planning for, and it has a 10-year investment plan. And Brazil has international reserves that are 7 times larger than those of South Africa. With much less, South Africa is doing much more. So I am not defending that international reserves should invest infrastructure investments, because macroeconomics does not work like that. But there is a freedom, degree of freedom for the country to plan and incentivize investment in infrastructure. How could we then? Is it possible to make feasible this new agenda that is so necessary? How could we do that of investment in infrastructure? The first point is to direct or target a more progressive taxation. But this happens in the midterm, and there are limitations. In general, tax changes lead to an effect and do not continue growing a long time. One other point that has been mentioned often is to cut compulsory expenditure in an open space for discretionary spending. Well, it does have a recession bias, so it ends up reducing basic collection, tax collection, and it also has limits because some key sectors such as health, education, and the environment require also compulsory spending. Also, through currency, this is something that the central bank has no control, does not have this power to finance via currency, because it depends on the demand for liquidity by the public. So the public debt may be, I believe, an important element to make feasible this development agenda.
So the transfer of federal public bonds are important for direct financing of public investments, and also to support the development banks and to finance private companies, or in partnership with the public sector, guaranteeing also purchasing power for families. Because Brazil is a big continent-sized country, it's necessary for domestic demand to be vigorous, and it's necessary to invest in the domestic market, because demand ultimately is an element that will justify for companies the need to increase private capital. Without this support to families, it's not possible to find internal demand that will justify the need for companies to increase private capital. On the other hand, I'd also like to mention, I know Professor José Alberto Afonso defends a limit for public debt, but I think, first of all, that it's very important to keep in mind that the Brazilian public debt is largely formed by committed operations. And this is part of the macroeconomic policy of the country. And so we see an increase in public debt in 2020, very much related to the increase in these kinds of policies in order to help the investment funds. And this has increased public debt. So it's not only the necessary expenditures to fight the epidemic directly, it was the action of the central bank as well. And so a very important measure, if we do want to make room in this public debt that is directed to investment and proper functioning of development banks, we need to go back to the discussion of the voluntary reserves so that the debt will not be so contaminated by operations that are common monetary policy operations. So the public debt, is it a limit for the new economic growth agenda? I think we do have room, although Brazil, well, the issue of elasticity was mentioned. So we do have some degree of freedom regarding external restrictions because of our volume of international reserves. So regarding the indicator or the rule for public debt, I think this has to be well thought of, because what would be the proper indicator? Gross debt is not the ideal one. It should be the net debt, because we need to consider assets, not only liabilities. And the net debt is considered by rating agencies in their evaluation as well. Also, the literature is showing changes, also changes regarding the share of debt and income. And so there's no consensus regarding this target. It may be restrictive. It may render unfeasible the process of economic growth and this investment plan that the country needs so badly. And we might observe to conclude that this indicator, when you do simulations, and the UFRJ Economics Institute has been working on this, and so this, when there is economic growth, there will be, well, this is not an indicator that will grow endlessly if there is an active policy to stimulate economic growth. So we need to resume economic planning. We need to, rather than imposing a limit for public debt, we should think that the government should be transparent vis-à-vis the private sector regarding the prospects for economic planning, enabling economic scenarios and how economic scenarios will enable economic growth, and allowing for this improvement in public debt indicators. And so these are my considerations, and I think Brazil needs to resume economic planning. There are institutions, there is human capital at development banks. The staff of development banks are highly qualified, and they can act in this sense. And without an infrastructure investment plan, Brazil will be left behind. And so institutions, we do have the right institutions. We need to make the best of the human capital and resume economic planning in order to rebuild physical capital. And so I'd like to give the floor to the debaters. So Adauto Modesto for his considerations. Thank you, Professor Julia. Good morning. Thank you, Lavínia, for moderating this panel. I'd first like to thank ABDE for the invitation and organizing this event. Also, as an economist, it's an honor to participate in such a high quality panel. In my comment, which will be very brief, I'd like to ask permission to go a little bit down, or a little bit, well, actually, to leave the more conceptual and theoretical aspects of development financing and get to more concrete everyday issues of those who are operating the process. And this is an attempt to find a bridge between the important discussions of this panel with what was discussed along the week regarding the role of development banks in this agenda. So I'll start with two figures which are important to give you an idea of points that I will bring up later. First, it's a 2014 study that shows that in order to finance effectively the full implementation of the 2030 agenda, we need to mobilize additional resources to the amount of $2.5 to $3.5 trillion annually by 2030. In recent OECD work paper, they argument that at least 65% of the 169 targets of the SDGs will demand some level of articulation, coordination with local governments in order to be implemented effectively. And so in short, these two figures suggest that any robust strategy for investments capable of promoting reconstruction, using the term proposed by José Roberto Afonso, economic and sustainable and inclusive reconstruction post-pandemic, this will demand huge efforts in mobilizing public and private resources above what we have today, or under any metrics that we use. And obviously, we will need, in such a big country as Brazil, we need to reinforce the role of regional and local governments. And this last point has been well addressed by my colleague Sávio. So the development banks, they have a key role in this effort for mobilizing resources and for strengthening subnational entities, given the representativeness and capillarity that they have in Brazil. So beyond their classic function in direct financing of projects, the development banks have also contributed to channeling private resources at global scale, catering to local demands. I'd like to point out recent issuance of a sustainable bond. I think Luciano mentioned this. We issued such bond at the end of last year at BDMG. It's an instrument that is very interesting for providing, for supporting programs, sustainable programs, and so resources were raised for investment in projects here in the state of Minas Gerais with direct impact on the ground. The development banks have an increasing role in the structuring of projects, and certain municipalities have difficulty structuring quality projects that are bankable and a little capacity to attract partners for execution. And so the development banks can support the design of such projects. There are project structuring platforms for this purpose, and they have been also through this activity in mainstreaming better risk management, especially social environmental aspects that Professor Rafael mentioned at the end of his presentation. Lastly, I'd like to point out that there is an agenda we haven't referred to yet, but which is significant in a more robust recovery of investments, which is the regulatory framework or environment. Any infrastructure asset, whether from private or public resources, they need a sound regulatory framework to guarantee reasonable costs. And so if at the federal level, this is a big challenge, when we look at states and municipalities, the issue is even worse. And it's important to invest in institutional strengthening and capacity building of public servants. And so these are the points I wanted to bring to our debate. Thank you, Professor Rafael, Professor Julia. If they can comment this briefly, thank you very much. Professor Luiz Esteves, thank you for. First, I'd like to thank the invitation and congratulate the ABDE and participating in this panel with you. And I'm going to be very quick. I think that basically in terms of infrastructure, as already mentioned, we have a challenge of reconstruction. And today the plan that we have, I'm not saying it's my plan, it's the plan on the table, which is basically investment will need to be mostly private. Public expenditures are subject to fiscal consolidation. It's not the state that will operate or exercise any leadership in reconstruction. Some aspects here, I don't remember in history that this has ever been done, a reconstruction at the level that will be required, with mostly private resources and the state basically with very small participation. I don't remember any time in history anyone has done this, and I hope we are lucky. One point is, what are the mechanisms? What is going to allow this? One point, the interest rate has never been so low, and a certain degree of liquidity. The 2 points here, 2 points that I'm going to mention. First, there's a lot of confusion between high and low risk. Another thing is not having any idea of what the risk is. If you don't have any idea of what the risk is, a high or low interest rate is completely irrelevant if you have no awareness of the risk. And so much of the infrastructure that we will have to rebuild, this has never been done before by the private sector. I once heard someone, an expert, BNB doesn't need to invest, is not supposed to invest in solar energy because the private sector does this. That's one point. Today, the private sector does this because today the private sector is able to price the risk, calculate the price of this. In the past, when the risk was unknown, it was mostly BNDES and BNB that did this. And so we actually tested the waters, and we look back and say, okay, it's safe.
After the risk has a price, then the challenge is easier. The challenge now is that those who are not used to investing in this learning curve and learning how to set price on the risk, will have to do that now. Now, another thing is we are going to have to learn other things too. We know that we always had success with microcredit. It is tacit knowledge. We don't know exactly how you got there, but some of this knowledge is just there. So maybe it is never going to go to the private sector. So these are essential points. One, risk is not given. Does not fall from heavens. We need to set prices in a learning curve. And second, maybe we cannot pass this on to the private sector in a more sophisticated manner and structured manner. Thank you. I'm sorry I exceeded my time. It is a shame we have to finish many interesting things. I am sorry that I will not be able to give the floor back to the speakers. And we have seen that there is a robust infrastructure cycle, sanitation, mobility, telecom, but we still have 2.2% of GDP, so it's not enough to close our infrastructure gap. So we need to strengthen our investment projects, macro, the regulatory framework, etc. And thank you for you who spoke about poverty and inequality. Unfortunately, we will need to conclude. And thank you about talking about being bold, Luiz Esteves. It was a very good panel. I am very sad we're going to have to conclude without final remarks by you. But thank you all very much.